There was flame in the night, blinding flame, and raucous, screeching thunder. And a great round of gleaming metal rising shudderingly on a cone of dazzling, roaring light. Rising to teeter at last on the tips of long, sweeping fans, teeter and rock and walk a bit on those blades of tempered nickel steel, until the swaying tower ceased to gyrate sickeningly across the stars, its motion settling into a quickening, shortening arc that died away into a tremble, a vibration, a stillness. Captain Savage took his gnarled and stubby fingers away from the firing manuals and sat down, drawing a sleeve across his sopping brows. "Nice work," said Pritchard. "One push and no correction blasts. Thy hand hath not lost its skill." The old man took a deep breath and grinned. "It's work for a younger man. Next time I'm going to let you do it. Or Sturgis." "There won't be a next time," said Pritchard flatly. The captain cocked a bright eye up at him. Pritchard gazed out a viewport. The horizon of Thisbe 2 lay like a worn hacksaw blade against the purple glow of Pyramus, rising. "Set watches," he said briefly. "The rest of the company can turn to for 6 hours. Then Sturgis, Green, Kemp and I are going off in the jets." "Fishing, I suppose?" said Savage with gentle irony. Pritchard smiled coldly and shook his head. "No. Witch hunting." Two plump silvery beetles screamed through the thin stratosphere high above the little planet. Behind them, dropping below the horizon, a needle stood gleaming in a black thumbprint. It was no longer possible to make out the smudge marring the Apollo's alabaster flank, much less the team now hanging in buckets from eye-bolts high in the nose, chipping away the cracked and carbonized glaze, cracked by last night's fall and carbonized by the hellfires of the writing operation. In one beetle rode the wiry Sturgis and stocky Kemp. In the other, the rangy blonde, Green, handled the controls while Pritchard studied the face of Thisbe 2 rolling slowly under them. "Got any ideas yet as to what hit us last night?" said Green. "Nope. After righting the ship, they turned on the floodlights, but neither then nor in the broad light of day was there any sign or trace of their visitor. A burial detail had laid McManus the traditional 6 feet into the crust of Thisbe 2. The long red thing had flopped and tossed startlingly as they sank hooks into it and dragged it off into the grass. Must have been the tail of something big, huh? How come it got past their radar?" Pritchard shrugged and continued to peer attentively ahead. "Sure is a mighty pretty hunk of country," sighed the blond boy. "In places it reminds me of the stuff around the Cumberland Gap. If it weren't for that lavender sunlight, that is." Pritchard didn't answer, his eyes steadily sweeping the terrain unfolding ahead. "That was a hell of a thing happened to poor Tom last night," Green went on. "Do you figure he had much pain before it finished him?" Pritchard made no response. "Tom was a right good boy, and a hard man to beat once he had the chance to get his feet under him. Remember the time Big Hayes hit him?" There was no answer. Green sat relaxed, one foot on the rudder bar and an index finger curled indolently around the jet firing toggle. "Boy, old Hayes let him have it before Tom was set. Just like you clipped him yesterday." "I thought you'd say that." Pritchard's voice was even. "You and the rest of the boys want to be sure I don't forget that, don't you?" "I wasn't meaning a thing, Chief," complained the other. "Hell, we understand. Tom made a mistake and, well. You can pass the word," said Pritchard softly, his eyes remaining hard on the vista ahead. "You can pass the word that I haven't forgotten the last thing Tom McManus said from me. Nor am I likely to." He grabbed the mic. "Cut, Sturgis, cut. Cut and glide, after me." Green, following instructions meant for him, too, snapped the jet toggle closed. The high-pitched thunder that had been chasing them across the sky was chopped off into utter silence. "What you got?" he managed to say, and then Pritchard's hip swung against him, neatly bowling him off the seat as the tall hunter thrust his feet toward the rudder bar. "Stand by to fire," snapped Pritchard over his shoulder. The younger man lurched toward the rocket controls in the nose in front of Pritchard as the jet cruiser heeled silently over into a dive. The bowl of Thisbe 2 tilted up toward them and its features steadied in the face of that harrowing plunge. Dead ahead lay a meandering thread of river stitching up a wide, jungle-filled valley. At one point the river either split into or broadened momentarily into a lake. At any rate, there was an island, right above the little flight side bead on the jet cruiser's prow. The island swelled into detail. It was fairly large, for up from its center thrust one of those strange rock mountains, the three straight planes of its cleavage converging in a jagged, towering peak, making it seem an elongated triangular pyramid that had been driven forth at a slant and had then had its extreme tip snapped off. The primrose light of Pyramus high above reflected now in a dazzling shimmer from one flank. At its base, or at the base of one impossibly machine-smooth wall, there was a semicircular mark, as if someone had carelessly strewn dirt across the olive-hued turf. The grains and clods of this dirt resolved themselves, as the jets whined on down, into a twinkling, tumbling cluster of ants, with gnats hovering and darting. Then they became something larger. Green turned to shout excitedly at Pritchard, but at that instant Sturgis's voice cracked from the two-way mic Pritchard had hung above him. "Hey, Chief, aren't those some of that girl's animals?" "Right," barked Pritchard. "That's a big rumpus down there. Follow me on down for a look. Then I think we'll try a couple of passes." "Passes? At what?" "Those are Miss Boyce's people, all right. They're fighting." There was no further chance to talk. Pritchard and Sturgis gripped their separate toggles almost simultaneously and their jets roared into life, feeding power to their dives for a pullout. The ground contact alarm chattered its warning that they were coming too close. As soon as the jets took hold, the pilots leaned back, pushing hard against the rudder bars. The tail elevators lifted into the slipstream, and the two silver beetles howled through a long pendulum swing that flung them far off into the sky. But the trained eyes aboard them had ticked off the essential details of the amazing battle being waged through the tall grass toward the mountain. "Holy rockets!" came from the blonde head in front of Pritchard. "That's a regular battle line they're holding. Did you see those babies fighting?" "Hey, Chief," cracked Sturgis, "what goes on down there, anyway? Who's fighting whom? Or what's fighting which?" Pritchard trimmed off into level flight before answering. "As far as I can make out, Cornelia Boyce's people are under attack, but I can't figure out who's doing the attacking. They're trying to hold that defense arc, but they're being snowed under. They're catching it from the air as well as on the ground. I recognize the animals inside that line. They're her people, all right. But I can't make out the attackers." He banked the cruiser around toward that now miles-distant little spine of mountain. Sturgis's ship followed him around as if fastened by a wire. "They looked like reptiles and big insects." "That's what they looked like to me. I don't remember seeing any of them yesterday, except for that bad dream I tried to shoot away from McManus. Anyway, there's sure a mob of them," cut in Sturgis. "The water all around that island is alive with them." "That kid was right about one thing," said Pritchard. "There's a much higher level of intelligence here than you'd find in Terran animals, for instance. But never mind that now. Listen, boys, this is a planned and directed attack. And we're going to buy ourselves a stack of chips and sit in on the game. But, first, did anybody see the girl?" "No," cracked the mic, and Green shook his head. "Well, I've got a hunch she's down there. She's mixed up in this somehow. I've a feeling a big battle like this is pretty unusual. This has all the earmarks of a war of extermination. And if those are her people protecting her, something, or somebody, has her cornered." "Could be," came Sturgis's voice. "But, then, who's this somebody or something?" "I don't know. I don't care. This scrap's nothing to us. But we want the wench, boys. We want her on account of last night. And maybe for a couple of other reasons. She'd better come home for a little psychotherapy, for one thing. Now, here's our plan of attack." Like the pointer of the sundial, the jagged spear of mountain lay its deep blue shadow across the curve of battle, as if to mark off the dwindling hours and minutes of life for those who struggled, writhing lay with glazing eyes in that long ribbony grass, now mashed and matted flat for acres in every direction, its pliant green-brown blades stained and matted dark. Red-eyed and snorting, the slate-gray boars stood shoulder to shoulder from one end of the yard to the other. As each one fell, the others closed ranks, shuffling backwards until their hides rubbed together again. Close behind them stood a thinning line of great-scaled bears, clawing and biting what got past the boars. And out among all their stiffly planted legs ran the lesser carnivores and the canines, snapping and worrying at the things creeping through the grass. Behind, in the shrinking zone of defense, roved the six-legged bovines and equines, and the leaping ones, and the shaggy-maned gorillas, prancing, goring, trampling, crushing. Overhead circled and hovered a swarm of hawks and condors, plunging and tearing. Against them came a nightmare horde. Those that could not fly or swim made clumsy rafts from odds and ends of vegetation and branches plundered from the jungle. Some scurried across on swaying creepers, all along the banks. Crawling, creeping things, reptilian and crustacean and multi-legged, undulating and gliding, disappearing into the grass to emerge at the last deadly moment. Scurrying, spiny things were there in force, scuttling over the mashed flat grass and beady-eyed haste to be in at the kill. Above them flew skull-headed, mandible-snapping horrors, with membranous wings. There were no tactics other than individual duel and the wearing down by sheer weight of numbers. Aloft, the winged ones met, clashed and fell, buzzing and flapping. Below, tusk and fang and claw and beak and hoof mandible rent and tore and worried and stung. The long, vicious lizards and the sudden striking snakes kept coming through only to go down under churning, stamping hooves or be shredded by horns and claws and fangs. Yet the battle was unequal. Slowly and wearily, the defenders gave before the superior numbers, the more skillful killing. The bodies they left dotting the meadow began to outnumber the crushed remains of the things they fought. Deep in a cleft in the bast of the mountain crouched a young Terran female, every inch of her brown body shaking in helpless terror. Cornelia Boyce's left hand gripped the handle of her long knife, still in its sheath. She would need it any time now. For the one was coming for her at last. Why, it had ordered its people against hers, calling them with its vicious mind from the far corners of this world, instead of coming for her directly. She didn't know. Perhaps it regarded her as the lesser objective and relegated the task of smashing her and her converts to this horde, while it moved against the ship. Perhaps it regarded the ship of the hunters with the same contempt it had had for the survey ship and was moving against her first, and was using this battle to toy with her, show her death, as it were. Perhaps there was some other reason. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore, for this was the end. It had tolerated her. For 4 of Thisbe-2's years, not quite 3 Tyrion years, the one had left her alone, almost, it would seem, keeping out of her way. It was as if it realized that she, the only one of her kind to survive the debacle at the survey camp, was essentially harmless. It had not minded her attempts to win over and tame and domesticate some of the people. After all, she had converted only the weaker and gentler of them with her synthotabs. She had gained control over only a small percentage of the killers, the lesser carnivores. No, she had never really threatened the one's dominance. Pritchard was right. Now that her carefully woven veil of illusion was torn away, she knew that there were killers. Everywhere. Always had been. Killers, killers, killers. The one proved that. It killed 100 times a day. This world was its preserve and it roamed and fed and slew as it chose, only occasionally for food. Perhaps this was the only reason for existence. In the last analysis, in a cruel cosmos one lived only to be killer or killed. It mattered not. This was the end. Angered by the advent of more of her kind, it had no doubt decided to wipe out both her and them, recognizing in them all a degree of intelligence which, in force, could threaten its control. It would move against the ship, if indeed it had not already done so. But it would certainly destroy her. This attack would have no other meaning. But she would cheat it. The one could not move faster than her knife. There was not much time now, and certainly no hope. The battle raging before her was mounting to its inevitable bloody climax. Her people could not hold out much longer. The courage and faith and loyalty might not survive so terrible an ordeal. Were not some of the birds already winging away to distant refuge? It was too bad. She would have liked to see the tall hunter once more before she. His eyes had been so piercing. She had forgotten what a man could be like. If only she had not been so balky yesterday. But it was not to be. He had come, in one of those two jet cruisers, thundering across the killer-infested meadow, and he had gone. He had seen and not understood. Battles between alien beasts were of no concern to him. He might even return, to make camera footage from aloft of this amazing battle. Hope flashed. She could signal him. What could she use? How could she catch a roving eye in a 10-mile-a-minute jet? She tossed up her head, eyes suddenly narrowed. Something came screaming around the mountain above her, followed by a second screaming something. Then hell erupted beyond the battle line. Blast followed concussive blast, causing the big gorillas to cower and the other ones to charge about in helpless panic. Between the jarring blasts sounded the rippling crackle of dual-mounted automatic snappers. The screams faded off into the sky. A stunned silence reigned along the battle perimeter. An acrid smoke drifted over the ground. Then, just as groups were sporadically renewing their death grips here and there, the twin screams sounded beyond the mountain again. 2 laps around the track and then to the showers, yelled Green, his fingers dancing over the rocket release and snapper buttons. Leaning back against the rudder bar, Pritchard grinned. You forget the passes along the river banks. They make it 4 laps. Then he threw a quick glance over his shoulder, but he couldn't make much through the welter of rising dirt columns. They came around the mountain in a tight curve. As they flattened for a run on the meadow they could see things scurrying for the water. The meadow itself was a churned and pitted mess. Bodies were thickly strewn everywhere. There she is, yelled Sturgis. You were right, Chief. See her, over by the mountain? A tiny figure, mounted on a 6-legged equine, was riding furiously back and forth. The defense arc was swelling outward, as her people rose to the offensive and began charging the demoralized attackers. Then the 2 cruisers were racing through the run on the as-yet unstrafed portion of the meadow furthest from the mountain. Sturgis's craft bucked as it rode the shock waves from Green's rocket blasts. As they shot in a wide curve around the other side of the mountain, Pritchard said, We'd better skip our last pass. Let's just sit down and work in close. I don't want her to get away. They cut jets and floated in over the jungle, side-slipping to lose speed. With feather-light fingers at their controls, the cruisers skimmed the trampled meadow grass and touched down their wheels. As they rolled, Pritchard and Sturgis flung open cockpit windows and let bright fire from their flamers spew over the ground, while Green and Kemp sprayed right and left with their snappers. Things struggled in the crisping, burning grass, crackling and roasting. Even as he turned the nozzle this way and that, Pritchard's face was a mask of disgust. All around the slowing ships, Cornelia's people galloped and raced with a vengeful, slaying lust. All out, said Pritchard. Everybody take a flamer. We'll have to burn a path to the girl. They climbed out and began walking toward the mountain 4 abreast, flame billowing ahead of them. There seemed to be only dead things in their path. Then, suddenly, the girl was there, astride a magnificent 6-legged equine type of animal, shaggy of coat and rather broad in the head. She had ridden around the wall of fire and her mount was trembling and shaking its head. They turned off the flamers and stared up at her. Rumbling, whinnying sounds came from the equine's throat. She grunted and cooed back, as if soothing it. Then she turned her eyes on the men below. We wish to thank you. Her pale face was drawn and there was a suspicion of tears in her voice. You came just in time. She seemed small and absurdly girlish perched on that long back. Those inadequate strips of hide were still her only covering. Pritchard nodded shortly. If you'll be so good as to keep your people out of our way, we'll sterilize this island. Just burn off all the cover and see to it there's none of them left. Why don't you herd your, friends over onto what we've already? That won't be necessary, she cut in. They'll all be gone in another minute. What makes you so sure of that? The one is probably calling them off. The what? She put her face in her hands. Pritchard frowned his puzzlement. How had so helpless a child managed to survive in a world like this? I'd like very much to know what this is all about, Miss Boyce, he said gently. In fact, the reason we happened along is that we are looking for you. We thought you might be able to explain what happened last night. As he told her, she lifted her face from her hands and her brimming eyes grew round. Before he had finished describing what they had found in the blower, she was shaking her head in despair. This is all you're doing. This world was at peace until you came. Now the one is aroused. You see, it was the one that went into your ship. The one? A crispness came into his voice. Miss Boyce, I think you'd better start at the beginning and give us a complete explanation. Just exactly what is this one you keep talking about? She closed her eyes again. A slight shudder ran through her body and she shook her head dazedly. The one, she murmured, is after us all now. It began by entering your ship. Then it sent its people against mine, against me. It won't stop until it has destroyed us all, and it's something I'd just as lief not describe. My people call it something which I have translated as the one. To them, it means first, or leader, or something like that. It was in control of all the people here on this bee when the survey arrived, and I'm afraid it still is. It wants to remain in control. You see, it's quite intelligent. I can believe that, Pritchard said. It not only figured out how to get into the ship, but it also figured out how to find McManus. Oh, no, I don't believe it just went after him. Wasn't his cabin the nearest to the place it entered? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, it was. Oh, you don't understand the one as I do, she cried. It would never be satisfied with just one. It came into your ship to feed on all of you. McManus was just the first person it found. From what you tell me, it wasn't even finished with him. There wouldn't be anything left. Then why did it go away? I couldn't tell you. Perhaps when your blower short-circuited, it arced a little. The one is very sensitive to fire. But it's not through. It will come back, one way or another. I think we can deal with it if it does, Pritchard smiled. And it sent these unpleasant things at you? How can it do that? He shot an appraising glance around the torn and bloody meadow with its mounds of dead and dying things. When he turned back, the girl was weeping. Sobs she could not suppress were shaking those nut brown, rounded shoulders. It has some kind of mental control, came her muffled voice. Besides, they fear it dreadfully. Oh, my people, my poor people. Well, now, look, soothed Pritchard, it's all over now. You'd better come back with us. I guess you've learned you can't make people out of all these animals. Besides, you've got an interesting story to tell the board. "Deed damn the BB board," she said a little unsteadily. "Then you'll take me with you." Pritchard smiled his broadest smile. "But of course." "Then let's hurry," she pleaded. "We have so little time." "Why? What's the hurry?" The one. She burst out in sudden anxiety. "It'll come for us any minute, don't you understand?" Okay, soothed Pritchard. He and the others were smiling at her excitement, when her equine suddenly reared so suddenly that she tumbled off. They started to her assistance, but she landed light as a cat on her feet. She stared wildly about her. The equine uttered a growl and galloped off. The girl remained crouched, her eyes darting in every direction. "Now what?" said Pritchard. "The one," she breathed. "It's somewhere near. My sextupt would never have bolted like that otherwise." "Oh, for Pete's sake," said Pritchard, taking her arm. "Come on. Say, Mr. Pritchard, what's that thing over there?" Kemp pointed off to his left. "Oh, God, no." Cornelia's voice was a quavering moan. Pritchard glanced where the stocky lad was pointing. What appeared to be an exceptionally tall and unusually red grass blade was wavering gently, as if bending to a mild breeze, about 50 yards off. "Hell," muttered Sturgis, "that face is familiar." Pritchard started walking toward it, the others following him. "Let's fan out a bit," he said, "until we see what this is." Come back," came the girl's agonized whisper behind them. "Don't go near." They ignored her. At a distance of 10 yards Pritchard halted. They all watched with consuming curiosity. The slender red thing was growing. Or, rather, it was pouring out of the ground, crumbs of dirt sticking to its glistening scarlet wetness, its delicately tapering tip now some 10 or 12 feet in the air. Pritchard shifted the flamer tank on his shoulders and started to say, "I think," when a maned gorilla eloping across the meadow some 100 yards away gave a sudden scream and broke into a wild, shambling run in the other direction. Another animal gave bellowing voice, and another, and abruptly there was commotion, spreading over the island toward the mountain. Pritchard cleared his throat. "Get around it, boys. Let it keep coming, but when I say the word give it the lick of fire." The waving red spire stood some 15 feet high now. As he circled into his position with the others, he noticed two things simultaneously. Another little scarlet tip was questing up through the trampled grass close to the first one. And, out of the corner of his eye he could see the animals that were Cornelia's people streaming either way along the base of the mountain, in a frenzied rout to get to the river on the other side. Then Cornelia's hands were clenching his arm, her voice banging hysterically in his ear. "Run, Pritchard. You don't know what you're up against." "Oh, believe me," she sobbed, "please, please, please believe me. This is the one." His eyes focusing on the growing scarlet tips, the second one had grown almost as high as the first. Pritchard smiled indulgently. "We're going to stay for the fun," he said. "What happened to all your friends? Stampeded, didn't they?" She opened her mouth to reply, but her answer was cut off by Green's sudden scream. Green screamed as McManus had screamed last night. Screamed and sank writhing to his knees. Some kind of frothing slime was running down over his shoulders and chest, dissolving the acid-repellent corduroy jacket, running down over Green from what had been his head. From between the bases of the now thick, tall red tongues, another jet of liquid squirted towards Sturgis. He leapt sideways and it missed him clean. "Holy damn!" he shouted. Pritchard gripped the flamer's trigger. "Give it hell!" he roared. 3 streams of fire converged in a ball of flame on the twin red spires. They disappeared in the rippling, booming fire. "Hold it!" Pritchard shut off his flamer and the others followed suit. Holding the nozzle before him, he walked to the place where the things had been. There was nothing there, except a hole where the tangled grass had been disturbed, and a kind of pit in the ground, into which loose dirt was still dribbling. He backed a step and turned the flamer on, playing fire into the pit and around it. Then he shut it off. "You fool," came the girl's voice at his elbow. "You damned fool. You just won't believe me, will you?" Pritchard lifted his gaze toward what had once been Cadet Green. Richard Harrison Green, a rollicking lad from the Cumberland Gap. Thomas Guilfoyle McManus, a man with the red-haired soul. McManus, first, and, now, Green. The hunter's face was turned to stone. "Keep your eyes peeled," he said harshly to the others and stalked off to the place where the squirt of liquid had landed after missing Sturgis. Some 30 feet from where it had been ejected, there was no grass but a 4-foot spear where the ground bubbled and frothed. The stench hovering over this spot was incredible, even to the man who had encountered it before. He turned to confront Cornelia, who had followed him. "I don't know whether I can get it through your thick head or not," she bit out. "You've simply got to get out of here. You can't get this through your thick head, Miss Boyce," said Pritchard between clenched teeth. "This thing, whatever it is, has killed 2 of my men. I'm quite ready to believe it is intelligent, possibly the most intelligent organism on this planet. But it's a killer just the same, and we're going to kill it. None of your idealistic theories are going to stop us, either. She stared at him, beginning to shake her head a little wildly. You can't kill it. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It can't be K. There was a sudden crash. Cornelia whirled and screamed. The three men and the girl stood transfixed. Over by the river, one of the jet cruisers was on its side, resting on a crumpled wing. The other was 40 feet in the air, and rising, held in the coil of an impossible red monstrosity rearing its long wet self into the sky. It was a worm, a very long, thin worm at least 100 feet long, not counting what remained underground. It towered some 50 feet into the air, about 35 feet more of it wrapped around the cruiser. At its tip, 2 15-feet-long feelers writhed and wriggled, as if still smarting from the scorching they had received. The coil slipped a little. The cruiser, looking more than ever like a beetle at this moment, slid slowly out and fell. And again it crashed into the cruiser on the ground and rolled ponderously off it. "Good God!" came Sturgis's voice shakily at Pritchard's elbow. The chief hunter was still too appalled to speak. He stared as the worm's rope-like body came curving down out of the sky, down to the cruisers again. Seeing how that red length alternately thinned to a 1-foot thickness and swelled again to 3 feet and more as it used around the cruiser that had remained on the ground, he had a vision of how it had entered the Apollo, shrinking itself to a mere 6-inch thread that poured through the intake port, seeping along the duct, swelling, bulging at McManus's air grill, and coming out of the ground, probably close to the ship. It had evaded the radar field. Cornelia's agonized face swam before his eyes. He felt his body shaking in the grip of her slender hands. Words. "Fool, run. Listen to me. It's busy smashing your ships. We have a chance. Run, to the mountain. Oh, dear God." At first he was like a sleepwalker. They turned him around and pushed him into a stumbling run, but his head turned back, his eyes large and almost vacant on that scene by the river. Then he was running. It was a good 200 yards to the mountain, but the grass was mashed to a springy tangle under their feet and they had only to skirt the thickly strewn bodies. The girl took the lead, the men not far in the rear, the nozzles of their flamers flapping out behind them. A crash, followed by a dull roar, came to them. They shot quick glances over their shoulders. The fuel tanks of one of the cruisers had let go and fire was blooming from the now distant beetle. The worm was arching wildly away, and then sinking in a curve to the ground. "How fast can it go on the surface?" panted Pritchard. "Much faster than underground," Cornelia muttered. "Why?" She was leading the way to the thin, rough ridge that marched up the mountain between two of its smooth plains of fracture. She sprang to the ridge and began running lightly up it. At 20 feet she stopped. The men were slower. The ridge was nothing but saw-toothed points of rock, hard and glassy and glittering. They had not had the girl's practice with it. She motioned Kemp past her and called down to Pritchard. "This is our only hope. I've never seen the one on any of these mountains. I'm sure it can't climb the smooth sides. And we can hold it back with our flamers." "Good girl. But hadn't we better get a little higher?" queried Sturgis. "Higher?" echoed the girl. "We've got to get to the top." Frantically, they climbed, taking insane chances, fantastically insecure holds, scrambling, cutting their hands on the raw rock edges, living a nightmare. At last Kemp and Cornelia, weak with exhaustion, sank against the ridge, gasping and heaving. Sturgis, next in line, had no breath with which to berate them. He could only crouch there and stare helplessly at them both. Pritchard braced his feet and dared to look down. The one was a straight red line across the meadow, a gleam of highlight from its wet side where the afternoon sun struck it. Unconsciously he thought of it now as Cornelia did, as a person. It was heading for the foot of the ridge. They all stared down, sucking in their tortured breaths. Waiting for it to reach the ridge and start climbing, Pritchard found himself studying it detachedly. He realized his courage and reason were somehow reviving. It was, after all, a worm. It differed from a 6-inch Terran night crawler only in that it measured about 150 feet in length, and was proportionately much thinner, like a snake. It also differed in those snail-like tips that probed out into slim, delicate points or contracted into thick stubs scarce 6 feet long. Those tips were investigating the jagged rock of the ridge now. And he saw that there were tips at the other end, too. But one was missing. Only a round stump accompanied the other long trailing feeler. It was a fair index of the one's terrible strength, Pritchard thought, realizing where the rest of that tip was now, that, in trying to wrench itself clear, it had knocked over a 100-foot, 5,000-ton spaceship. "It's coming," said Kemp in a shrill, brittle voice. The hunter shot a glance at the stocky youth and saw he was fighting hysteria. The one was rippling slowly up the ridge. Pritchard guessed its speed was greater than it seemed at that distance. Like a scarlet river, it poured steadily up. "After I've used this," said Cornelia in an even, conversational voice, "you gentlemen can have it if you don't mind having to pull it out of me." She held up her long knife, and there was no expression on her face. Kemp and Sturgis could only stare at her. Pritchard couldn't warn her by asking them to take it away from her, and anyway this was no place for a wrestle. "And why do you think we would want that?" he asked in as pleasant a tone as he could manage. "So much better than a flamer or jumping," she replied. "Take my advice and—" "I wish you would pull yourself together," said Pritchard. "You're frightening Kemp up there." Startled, Kemp stared back down at his chief, and then he closed his mouth in a firm line. Pritchard congratulated himself that the remark was a stone that had slain 2 birds. "You don't honestly think there's a way out of this?" exclaimed Cornelia, with "What I wouldn't give for my snapper," breathed Kemp. "Or one of those 5-inchers, and Sturgis jerked his head as the little tumbled beetles over at the river. "There isn't a rocket tube down there I trust now," said Pritchard. "They're all bunged out of alignment. Some of the snappers might still be in shape to use." His voice trailed off. Something was taking shape in his thoughts, something revolving about a word Cornelia had uttered, the word jump. "Well, what could we do?" muttered Sturgis tensely. The worm was still well below, but coming steadily up. They could see the little scarlet tips now, questing over the jagged edges. Behind was all humping redness. "We were very foolish," Pritchard checked himself. "I was very foolish. I permitted us to be outmaneuvered. The one thing that monster doesn't want is for one of us to get back to the cruisers." "I've been thinking," Sturgis cut in. "Why don't we empty all our flamer tanks along the ridge here, climb all the way to the top and then, as soon as it's almost there, spark the fuel and give it a good roasting?" Pritchard shook his head. "I thought of that. You forget how volatile that stuff is. By the time it gets there, no, I've got a better use for the flamers." He began unstrapping the tank from his shoulders. "Kemp, pass yours on down. No, hang on to it, just in case. Sturgis, you take my position and hold it off as long as you can." He glanced at the gauge on the light plastic tank and shook his head grimly. "Okay, children, let's get going, to the top." The mountain wasn't really much of a mountain, being only some 500 feet high. Their first frantic scramble up the ridge had carried them almost 2/3 of the way. Behind them, the worm was flowing steadily upward, like a river of blood, along the narrow ridge. "Kemp," panted Pritchard as the short young man finally and painfully inched over the knife-edged peak. Kemp turned, stretching out a hand to Cornelia to help her up and over. "Yes? I'm putting this girl in your charge. She's your responsibility." "What are you going to do?" put in Cornelia quickly. Pritchard looked up into those gray-green eyes so intent upon him. A pang of regret stabbed through him. He was no longer seeing her sweet line body. Here was a girl he could have ridden the starways with. A person with enough courage and resource to have held her own in this killer-infested Eden. "I'm taking a powder, as they used to say back on good old Terra. I'm gambling. Gambling that I can get back to the one cruiser that hasn't burned up all its wiring, and call the ship." He slapped the leg pocket of his breeches. Kemp nodded. The pocket contained a ready-packed emergency chute. Cornelia shook her head slowly. You'll never make it." "You might," said Kemp. "I'll bet I can," said Pritchard. "I've got to." "The one will get you," she said. "It can get into one of those things easily. It'll take only a little of its digestive juice." Her face puckered and those emerald eyes shone brighter, but she fought for and regained control. "So?" Pritchard smiled. "You'll be well rid, then, of that notorious big game hunter, Elmer Pritchard." "I don't want to be rid of him," she said softly. "I want him with me, at the end." He bowed. "Thank you, Miss Boyce." "Call me Cornelia, please." "And you," he said, "may call me Elmer, a name I permit no one to use." He bent forward. "But you, now." Their lips brushed and clung. "Fine time for lovemaking," muttered Kemp. Below them, a flamer squealed suddenly. Sturgis, unknown to them, had lingered behind. Now, 100 feet down the ridge, he fired a burst at the worm, a warning burst, for the dread feelers hung high above his head on a long, curving tendon of red wetness. The flamer had an effective range of only 30 feet, but the slimy scarlet rope curved away, dropping off to one side and extending out into the air. The feelers contracted to mere knobs and the end thickened into a club. A haymaker, drawing back, poised and cocked. Pritchard saw it and howled, "Sturgis! Duck!" But there was to be no ducking that swing. Sturgis hugged the thin spine of crag and threw up a blossom of fire. But the rope came flailing about, slashing through the flame, and neatly flicked him off. They watched the body arcing out over the meadow, the spare flamer of Pritchard twisting after it, and saw it sink on down, to stop suddenly against the turf. Kemp began to curse. Pritchard pulled the emergency chute pack from his leg pocket and began snapping the light harness about his long frame. "Cut that out," he said coldly. "Just hang on, Kemp, and watch. If I've got his baby figured out right, it's going to lose interest in you two in about as many seconds." "Goodbye, Elmer," came Cornelia's voice forlornly. The worm's first half was recovering from the follow-through of that swing, draping itself back along the ridge yard by relentless yard. Pritchard turned, holding the chute cord in his fist. He forced a grin that he was afraid looked more like a grimace. "So long, kiddies," he said, and jumped. At this point the leaning peak overhung the ground and he flung himself as far out as possible, trying for distance. The smooth, almost polished wall slanted away from him and the meadow swung upward. He pulled the cord at the last minute. As the filmy needle billowed above him, and the harness seemed to jerk him back up from the onrushing ground, he managed to twist a glance back up at the ridge. The one was motionless. That was good. It had seen him. Then he drew up his knees. The ground slammed into him and he lay there, stunned, letting the filmy folds flutter down over him. Then he was up, bruised but whole, on his knees and scrabbling out from under the light gray stuff. By crawling under every line he avoided entanglement and in a minute was clear and running, unsnapping the harness as he went. Not until he was well away from the mountain did he dare glance over his shoulder. Then he almost stumbled, at the chill terror gusting through him, freezing every muscle. The worm was a red festoon, drooping from the ridge. Even as he looked, its whole length came off, to fall writhing out of sight momentarily at the base of the mountain. He hadn't expected that. He had planned for it to back laboriously down the way it came, giving him a decent margin of time. But it had crossed him up. Now he had seconds instead of minutes. He put his head down and dug in, pumping his tired, aching legs furiously. This was the worst gamble of his career, against the longest odds. He had no idea how fast the worm could go on level ground. Suddenly, he was racing a shadow in the slanting light of Pyramus, setting through the afternoon. Something like an elongated caricature of a snail's head crept across the grass beside him, two long slivers of tapering purple shadow. Then he saw his flamer, lying almost dead ahead where it had landed after being catapulted off the ridge. Sobs rasping his throat, he slanted toward it, dove and rolled, to come up clutching it. There was a spattering sound close by, a spatter that changed to an angry fizzing. Pritchard swung the nozzle up in the very face of the glistening red column swaying toward him. He squeezed the handle grip. Through the booming flame, he saw the shape twisting aside and followed it with fire. It went down to the ground, backing away into a swelling body. The worm writhed desperately away from that searing plume of licking flames. Pritchard wheeled and ran toward the cruiser that had not burned. Evil-smelling juice slashed across the upturned belly of the ship as he savagely wrenched open the buckled door and tumbled in, dragging the flamer in after him. He stumbled across the roof struts and lunged for the upside-down radio panel. The cruiser's radios were on their own battery-powered circuits. He snapped the power on and heard the slow hum and sputter of the warming tubes. He poked in the button labeled .M. SIG. A standard repeating distress call on a tight beam. Then he was flung against the opposite wall. As he struggled back to his feet, pressure against them told him the cruiser was rising, and he knew very well it was not doing so under its own power. A glistening red wall bulged against the door frame through which he had come. Pritchard realized that once again the cruiser was being hoisted aloft in the worm's coil. It was going to drop him, to kill him quickly, rather than poke inside and face his flamer. Pritchard snatched the flamer and staggered toward the opening. Jabbing the nozzle into that scarlet slime, he gripped the handles. Roaring heat beat back at him. He braced himself, ignoring his own singeing flesh and crisping hair. The cruiser struck ground with a crash. He was flung sideways, threw up an arm, and heard it snap. He dragged himself to the door which now was turned to the ground. Gritting his teeth against the pane, Pritchard hung his head through the opening and peered out. It was a crazy nightmare. The meadow was the ceiling, to his inverted eyes, against which a giant red ribbon rolled and dried in fantastic configurations. Every melting convolution, every arching loop, expressed pain and wrath. And, now and again, a livid blotch appeared along its length, alternately turning purple and yellow, and dripping streamers of drool. Then came a sound, a great tearing sound in the sky. Pritchard hauled himself back into the ship and crawled to the radio. He switched off the automatic signal and cut in the transmission band. "The hell you got down there?" came Captain Savage's rasp. "Is that you up on the rock, Mr. Pritchard? Mr. Pritchard?" "Captain!" yelled Pritchard. "Step on it. Come down on that monster." "I'm all right. Come ahead." Then he snatched up a pair of solar goggles and worked his way to a viewport, in time to see the Apollo, a magnificent column of metal in the sky, descend on a pillar of incandescence, at the bottom of which lay something that bubbled and cooked, rising in a last great arch of simmering agony. The snaggle-toothed horizon of Thisbe 2 was rising across the dull indigo disk of setting Pyramus. Pritchard and Savage sat in their gimbal chairs in the forward lounge. The old man's wispy white hair stirred in the evening breeze sucked in by the blowers. "And every time I wonder if my hunting days aren't over," sighed Pritchard. Experimentally, he worked on the flexicast on his right arm. "Huh," grunted the captain. "Not you. 1 week on Terra and you'll be telling yourself the next time it just can't be as bad. Or that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. Anything, you'll tell yourself. Anything to start." Cornelia appeared in the doorway. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said coolly. She was wearing corduroy slacks and a soft neo-slip blouse, that seemed to enjoy clinging to her contours. "Good evening," croaked Captain Savage. He stood up, and stretched restlessly. "Oh, don't go," said Cornelia. "Well, if we're blasting off in the morning, I've got things to do. These days it's the old men who do all the work." He chuckled as he eased past her through the door, and gave her shoulder a little pat. "Good hunting." The girl watched him go down the passage. "Whatever did he mean by that?" she inquired. "Good hunting." "Oh, it's just an expression," said Pritchard vaguely. She came over to him and turned about on her bare feet. "No shoes that fit," she said. "How do you like what I managed to scrounge from the men?" He pulled her down to him with one lazy reach of his good arm. I'm afraid," he murmured, "that I liked you better the way you were. You know," she spoke muffledly against his shoulder, "you're something of a beast.